Good evening. I hope you can all hear me, and thank you very much for joining me tonight for the Art UK Unlocked talk as well. The photo that you have in front of you is Carnarvon Castle, and this is where the museum is situated in Carnarvon itself, Gwynedd, North Wales. It's in the heart of Snowdonia. And thank you, as I said before, very much for joining me this evening to look at some of the art that we hold in the RWF Museum collection. My name is Mrs. Anne Pedley, and I am a trustee of the RWF Museum Trust, and I have a personal interest in art and in literature as well. The theme of the talk this evening is commemoration, as this week is Remembrance Week, and I have chosen 4 portraits from the collection, predominantly World War I, that not only commemorate an image of one of the many who lost their lives in World War I, but also in these cases have a link to literature as well. Right, throughout the ages, there's been battles and war losses, probably since the beginning of the times. I'm sure if we could go back in a time machine, we'd to the Stone Age, we'd see Stone Age drawings on the wall commemorating local battles and such like. If we move a little bit earlier, a little bit further on in time as well, the Great Babylonian Reliefs show lots and lots of battles that they won there as well. Move forward a little bit more, and certainly the stories of the Greeks by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey tell us about the great battles of Troy and how Odysseus got back afterwards. And then, of course, there is the sequel, the Aeneid by Virgil, that tells us of the foundation of Rome as well, all battles that are fought in there as well. If we come a little bit further in front in time as well, think about Tennyson's, Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, that tells us about the Battle of Balaclava. Into the Valley of Death rode the 500. This was written for the Crimean War, the Battle of Balaclava, 1854. And that highlights just a few examples. There are many that you could look to about how people were commemorating war and battles in the past. The height of commemoration, though, I think really occurs during World War I. And this is really in order to come to terms with the terrible losses on the Western Front and beyond as well. The thousands and thousands of men that were being killed week by week as well. You've only got to take one example, the first day of the Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July, 1916, where 19,000 casualties occurred in one day, probably most of them before midday as well on the 1st of July. So one form of commemoration that we do see every day, and you will walk past them, is local memorials. And this is my local memorial here in North Wales. There are 62 names on the war memorial. Most of them were worked at the quarry. We have a quarry here as well. And most of them were like pals, and they served in France, Flanders, but the majority of the casualties on the war memorial were from Gallipoli. And as you can see, we've got a little bit of Welsh at the top, Ercoff in memory, and then Until the Day Dawns in English as well. Few of the men that were at summer camp in 1914 would have thought that almost a year later they were going to be landing on the shores of a foreign field, Suvla Bay at Gallipoli. The second piece of commemoration that I'd like to look at is a memorial plaque. And you'll recognise these maybe as the bronze memorial tablets that were awarded to the next of kin of the fallen. This one is in our archives, and it's a memorial plaque to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Osbert Samuel Cadogan. He was the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion. It's bronze, designed by Edward Carter Preston, and Hal Cadogan was the commanding officer who lost his life during 1st Ypres on the 30th of October 1914, and he is buried at Hugo Crater Cemetery in Belgium as well. Quite often you see these plaques have also been inserted into family graves as well. Another type of memorial was to publish a memorial volume by families of the sons that they had lost in the First World War. There are a couple for ladies that lost their lives in the First World War, but it's predominantly soldiers. So these memorial problems usually consisted of letters written from home, from where they served. This one was printed for private circulation by Cornish brothers in 1918 by the family of Captain Dan, or Daniel Dan Bradby, who was killed in action at the Battle of Arras on the 9th of April 1917. Dan was a little bit of an artist himself. He did cartoons and little vignettes of life on the Western Front, and you can see these were included in the books as well. Dan was only 20, so that they are very, very limited biographies, but the letters that are contained, Dan was on the Western Front for 2 years, give you a very, very realistic picture of what life was like during the First World War in the trenches, because they're not memoirs, they were actually written at the time, so they have this immediacy of the letters that were written home as well. So, national memorials. This is the magnificent Royal Artillery Memorial at Hyde Park Corner. And this was by the sculptor Charles Sergeant Jagger, who himself had served as an officer in the army on the Western Front. And you can see its large gun, a howitzer, is pointed towards the Western Front. I think it's pointed towards Ypres. These large memorials were commissioned some years after the war ended. I think this one's 1925. And they, again, you can see them all over the country. There's a Scottish National Memorial. There's a National Memorial in Cardiff as well. I'm sure there's one in Dublin and also in Belfast too. So these occurred in the 10 years probably after the war ended. The most famous, of course, is the one that we will see on Sunday, and that is the cenotaph that was designed by Edward Lutyens. And this was unveiled very quickly, actually, in 1920 to commemorate the war dead of Britain and the Empire. And it was later modified to include those, of course, that were killed in World War II as well. Finally, and again, I could have shown you many sort of items. This is a medal set, and this medal set belonged to Sergeant J.S. Varco, Royal Welch Fusiliers. If we look from left to right, the first medal is a Distinguished Conduct Medal. That's second in only to the Victoria Cross. He was also awarded a military medal for bravery. And then the three that follow it from the middle to the right are what is normally known as the Pip, Squeak and Wilfred. And these were the campaign medals that were awarded in World War I, providing that you were within a timeline. You would almost definitely have got two of them there as well. The one in the middle, you had to have joined 1914 to 1915. So the first portrait that I've chosen is of Captain Arthur Legge Samson, 1882 to 1915. It's an oil on canvas by Charles Poles, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, 1860 to 1942. And I can find out very little about Charles Poles, apart from the fact that he was predominantly a landscape artist. So it's possible that the family knew him to commission this painting. We also know little of Captain Samson's life. We've got no letters, very few photographs. There's nothing that's emerged. If anybody knows of anything, I'd love to know. But all that we can put together about him is that he was the son of a clergyman who lived in Rugeley, Staffordshire, in a beautiful cottage in Rugeley. He was educated at Eton and Merton College, Oxford, and then went on to the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst. So he was a pre-war regular. He'd seen service in India and Burma with the 2nd Battalion Royal Welch Fusiliers. But what we can learn about Captain Samson's life is a little bit that was written about him by Robert Graves in his memoir, Goodbye to All That. Now, Robert Graves is on the right, looking rather wonderful in his uniform and incredibly young as well. And Robert Graves tells us about the opening day of the Battle of Loos on the 25th of September, 1915. Captain Samson and his company go over the top. They are immediately shot down by ferocious machine gun fire. Captain Samson is seriously wounded, but he hasn't died, and he's left out basically beside the wire, the German wire, all night. Robert Graves tells us in Goodbye to All That that several attempts were made to rescue him, and these also resulted in fatalities. On the final attempt, Captain Samson got a message back saying, please, please do not try to rescue me. It's murderous out here as well. But although we can read about that in Goodbye to All That, Robert Graves also wrote a poem about him called The Dead Foxhunter. And this is what he said. We found the little captain at the head. His men lay well aligned. We touched his hand, stone cold, and he was dead. And they, all dead behind, had never reached their goal, but they died well. They charged in line, and in the same line fell. The well-known rosy colours of his face were almost lost in grey. We saw that dying in a hopeless case, for others' sake that day, he'd smothered all rebellious groans. In death, his fingers were tight clenched between his teeth. Captain Samson is buried at Cambrin Churchyard Extension Cemetery in France as well. And although we know little about his life, Robert Graves, in his memoir and by that poem, tells us a little bit about his death as well. So the second portrait that I've chosen is that of Lieutenant Randall Alexander Kassen, 1893 to 1917, and it's an oil on canvas by the Society portrait artist Sir Gerald Festus Kelly, 1879 to 1972. Kelly also had lost a cousin in the war, Captain Edward Dennis Festus Kelly, so he was, he would know what loss was like when he was doing this portrait of Randall Kassen. And Randall was the only child of Randall and Lucy Kassen, who lived between homes in Chester and Porthmadog in North Wales. He attended Winchester College, Christ Church College, Oxford, and enlisted almost immediately war broke out in 1914 and joined the 2nd Battalion in 1916 on the Western Front. Randall Kassen was also the first cousin to the actor Sir Lewis Kassen, and also his wife, the very famous actress Sybil Thorndike. And both Lewis and Sybil both lost brothers in the war as well. Major William Kassen of the London Regiment died on the 25th of September 1915, the same date as Captain Samson, during the Battle of Loos, and Second Lieutenant Francis Herbert Thorndike was with the Royal Flying Corps and died of wounds on the 17th of August 1917. So the family itself, the Kassen family, had great losses during family losses during the First World War. This time it's Siegfried Sassoon who refers to Randall Kassen several times in his diaries, and also he appears in Memoirs of an Infantry Officer under the pseudonym of Shirley. And this is what Sassoon has to say about Shirley. So I'll call him Kassen, I think. It's much more, better to do that. Kassen, aged 23, had been at Winchester and Christchurch. He was a sensitive, refined youth and an amusing gossip. Kassen and I spent the night in a very small dugout. How we got in, I can't remember, but we considered ourselves lucky to be sitting around with a little brazier talking to the trench mortar sergeant major. Lieutenant Kassen is also commemorated in a book that's not so well known, and that's Frank Richards's memoir, Old Soldiers Never Die. Whereas Sassoon and Robert Graves were both officers, Frank Richards remained a private, deliberately, he said, throughout the First World War. And this is what Richards has to say about the death of Lieutenant Kassen. So there was a strong point. Oh, sorry, let me start from the beginning as well. Richards was a private soldier, as I said, and then he tells us that Kassen died during a heavy bombardment with 2 other RWF officers. There was a strong point called Black Watch Corner. A few yards outside the trench was a pillbox, which was Battalion HQ. Kassen at this point had been chosen as the adjutant. The enemy now began to heavily bombard our position, and Major Poor and Mr. Kassen left the pillbox and got into a very large shell hole, which had a deep, narrow trench dug in the bottom of it. In less than 15 minutes, a howitzer shell had pitched clean into it, killing both. During the day, shells fell all around the pillbox, but not one of them made a direct hit. So if they'd stayed there, they would have been, well, at least for that moment, safe. Kassen was killed in action at Polygon Wood, on the 26th of September 1917 during the battle, the third battle of Ypres, which we know as Passchendaele. Some years later, a farmer was ploughing up the fields in that area because it is a predominantly farming area, and he found a silver frame with a photograph in it, and the photograph was, the portrait must have been drawn from the photograph or painted from the photograph as well. And this now I think you can see in the Passchendaele Museum. It's likely that there was a relative that visited the area or the grave as well, because he does have a grave, and it got left there but probably moved or went into the mud at some point as well. So it's quite unusual that he actually found that too. The third watercolor that I've chosen, and this is somewhat different. This is of Company Sergeant Major Frederick Barter, VC MC. It's a watercolor on paper by Lady Elizabeth Thompson Butler, again from a photograph. And the photograph is, they've taken all the rest of the people out, but it's of the remnants of what was left of the battalion after the Battle of Festubert in 1915. So this is from a set of watercolors by the very famous war artist Lady Butler. And she did a series of these portraits of VC recipients. And these were first shown in the Leicester Art Gallery in London in 1917 in order to raise funds for charity. Lady Butler, of course, was very famous for her battle art. You can see this in many of the great museums and houses in the UK. Such as the defence of Rorke's Drift, South Africa, the most famous one perhaps, Scotland Forever, with the Scots Greys charging, almost looking as they're charging at you. And again, the other very famous one of Dr. Brydon riding on his exhausted horse to the gates of the fort at Jalalabad after supposedly the only survivor of an Afghan attack on the army, on the British Army. So if we look at Fred Barter there, he looks completely different to Fred Barter, who's photographed here, being congratulated by his fellow comrades at Cardiff after the award of his Victoria Cross. It's a wonderful picture. So CSM Barter was awarded the VC for his actions during the Battle of Festubert, and on the 16th of May, Barter with 8 volunteers attacked the German lines with grenades and bombs. 3 officers and 102 men from the German army surrendered. He captured 500 yards of enemy trenches and then cut the wires on 11 mines. In a very strange coincidence, after Barter was commissioned, he served in the Middle East. And on the 10th of April 1917, he with his company found themselves under heavy Turkish machine gun fire for over 5 hours. Within his party was rifleman Kara Bahadur Rana, and he ran up to the Turkish enemy machine gun. He silenced the machine gun. It doesn't quite say how he did that, I suspect with bombs. And then this allowed Barter and his comrades to withdraw. And in a strange coincidence, this action for this rifleman Rana was also awarded the Victoria Cross. So Fred Barter had been involved in 2 Victoria Crosses in his lifetime, or in his service on the Western Front. The Battle of Festubert, and this is a watercolour that we have on paper by Gerald Mears. You can see by his dates, 1911 to 1980, that he couldn't possibly have served in the war, but it shows the abomination of desolation, I think, on the Western Front, the terrible vision of no man's land. Festubert was one of the battles in 1915 that really, people knew then that the war was going to be extended for years as well. The war was not over by Christmas. We had the battles in June ending in Festubert. Gallipoli was a failure. And then as we go towards the end of the year, Loos, where it was the first time where the British used gas. The Germans had used it in April 1915 at Ypres. Nothing. We still remained in a stalemate, unfortunately, at the end of 1915. And then the great battles of 1916 on the Somme would take place a year later as well. So let me go on to the next one. This is Major Geoffrey Lee Compton Smith with his DSO ribbon there as well, 1889 to 1921. He was born in London on the 19th of August, 1889. His cousin was Sidney Lee, the woodcut engraver. And as per most officers, he was educated at Radley College and the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. Geoffrey Compton Smith was a very keen amateur artist, and he did produce some very, very nice drawings and paintings. And just at the opening, just before World War I started, he had enlisted in a drawing course at the Slade in London, and that's where he met his wife, Gladys Lloyd. It was a short drawing course of fine art, and this was in 1914. They married in 1916. Gladys, he always called her Glad, introduced him to John Nash, the brother of Paul Nash, Mark Gertler and Dora Carrington. Paul Nash, of course, and John Nash both did war art during World War I. So he was in there with that set of artists that were very famous in the first part of the last century. His sister, Priscilla, also enrolled in an art course at the Slade. And in one of the many photos that they took of their annual picnic in 1913, she's revealed there, along with Gertler, Nash, and Dora Carrington as well, at a picnic too. So Geoffrey Compton Smith was a keen yachtsman. And you can see here Geoffrey with his wife Gladys as well. And he served with both Robert Graves and Siegfried Sassoon. And Siegfried Sassoon refers to him as Major Robson. He always uses pseudonyms in his books, for not the real names for people. And in Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, he relates the story of a raiding party on the Somme on the 25th of May 1916, in which Major Robson was second in command. Both Geoffrey Compton Smith and Gladys lost brothers in the conflict. Geoffrey Compton Smith's brother, Lieutenant Roger Noel Compton Smith, was killed at Gallipoli, and Gladys lost two brothers, Second Lieutenant Robbie Lloyd, who was with the Royal Flying Corps, and Second Lieutenant Wynell Lloyd, who was with the Royal Engineers. Geoffrey Compton Smith survived the First World War, and he joined the 2nd Battalion Royal Welch Fusiliers in Ireland after the war ended. So he's still a regular officer. He continues his service after the war. He doesn't go home and take on another job. He was taken hostage by the IRA whilst on a sketching trip, and I've put that in inverted commas on my notes because it's likely that he was doing reconnaissance or undercover work as well. And this was on a sketching trip to Blarney on the 16th of April 1921. Now, this was in retaliation by the IRA, who had had several of their members executed at Dublin for being members of the organisation. Geoffrey was held with his captors, Slaney, and he got on quite well with them. There was a week or so that he was held with them. He knew that he was going to be shot in retaliation, and he was allowed to send 2 letters, one to his wife and one to the regiment. And in the letter to the regiment, he said, "I would like my death to lessen rather than increase the bitterness which exists between England and Ireland." Now, the letter with the silver cigarette case that came with it is on display at the museum in Carnarvon. Major Compton Smith was executed by the IRA on the 30th of April, 1921. Now, if I just go back slightly, hopefully. Now, the portrait that the artist has stated as unknown on the Art UK site, I've been able to identify who actually produced the portrait as well. And this was done from a photograph of Geoffrey by his sister-in-law, Catherine Constance Lloyd. And this is the portrait that hangs in the Royal Welch Fusiliers Museum at Carnarvon. There's also a portrait by Geoffrey Compton Smith by Sir John Lavery at Dublin City Art Gallery. So let me go forward once again. And let me take you back. I think that takes me up to just about half an hour with a little bit to spare. Takes us back to Carnarvon Castle. And really the art that we have on display and on display at Art UK, we are very lucky to be able to link that with the literature of the Great War as well. Not just Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves and Frank Richards, but also David Jones, who was an artist himself, Captain John Dunn, who wrote The War the Infantry Knew, which is a compilation of memoirs of World War I, He was the medical officer for the 2nd Battalion, and also perhaps Wales's national World War I poet, Hedd Wyn, who served with the 15th Battalion Royal Welch Fusiliers. I think that brings me to the end of my talk. I hope you've learnt a little bit about some of the portraits that we have on display. And thank you very much for listening to me tonight. Thank you.